preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y for the first evening of our annual series, The Shape of the City. Before introducing our guests, let me take a moment to clarify you a change in the series. Philip Johnson, who was originally to have opened the series tonight, is unable to be with us this evening. In his stead, Stanley Tigerman, who was to have participated on November 3rd, has kindly agreed to switch dates with Mr. Johnson, and he will be here tonight. The rest of the series remains the same as originally scheduled. The format is as follows. We will open with a short slide presentation, which will serve as a visual point of reference for the ensuing conversation between Mr. Tigerman and our series moderator, Paul Goldberger. The final segment of the evening provides you the opportunity to submit written questions on the index cards you received upon entering the hall. During the course of the evening, ushers will come down the aisles, collect the cards, and bring them backstage for presentation. Our moderator, Paul Goldberger, is a familiar face at the 92nd Street Y, having moderated this series for 4 years prior to this, our 5th anniversary season. For those of you who do not know him, permit me a brief introduction. Since 1973, Mr. Goldberger has served as architecture critic of the New York Times, where he writes for the daily paper, the Sunday magazine, and the book review sections. He has also contributed to numerous other publications, including Art in America, the New York Review of Books, and Architectural Record. The author of The City Observed, New York, an Architectural Guide to Manhattan, Paul is the recipient also of the American Institute of Architects Medal in recognition of his unique role in furthering the understanding of architecture and its impact on contemporary culture. And in 1984, it was the recipient of the prestigious Pulitzer Prize. We're particularly pleased to welcome him back to the Y this season. Our guest this evening is Stanley Tigerman, Director of the School of Architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and principal partner of Tigerman, Fugman, McCurry. After receiving his architectural degrees from Yale, Mr. Tigerman began his own architecture practice. His firm has been engaged in building throughout the United States, as well as in Canada, West Germany, and Bangladesh. Mr. Tigerman has been a visiting professor and lecturer at many universities in the United States and abroad, including at Harvard and Yale. In 1980, he was appointed architect in residence at the American Academy in Rome. Mr. Tigerman publishes many articles and books, including Versus, which received an AIA Honor Award in 1982. Among many other awards and honors was the 1985 First Alumni Art Award from Yale University. We are delighted that Mr. Tigerman is here with us tonight. And now I'm going to turn the podium over to Paul Goldberger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm delighted to be back here for the fifth year of this series that has been really a great joy for me, I know for our guests, and I hope for you. Before I turn the platform over to Stanley Tigerman and we begin the evening, I'd like to mention one other thing on a different subject, but one that touches architecture as well as the rest of our lives. Last year, those of you who were with us then will remember that one of the most stimulating evenings was the one featuring Charles Gwathmey as our guest. Stanley Tigerman and I just met a couple of hours ago at a funeral home where Charles Gwathmey's stepdaughter, who was killed in a hit-and-run accident on Saturday, was. It's a tragedy that has affected not only the architectural community of this city, but as I've talked to people today, really the entire city. I'd ask if we might begin this evening with just a brief moment of silence. Thank you. Let me now introduce Stanley Tigerman, who will run through some slides of his recent work very quickly, as Laura Kaminsky told you. The format, as in past years, is really just to give you a kind of visual memory bank or context of images. The lights will then go up very quickly, the curtain will disappear, chairs will magically appear, and we will sit and begin the conversation that's the featured part of the evening. And as before, of course, you're invited to submit questions on index cards, pass them to the ushers who, midway during the program, will begin to circulate, and they'll be sent up to the stage for us to respond to. So let me now turn the lectern over to Stanley Tigerman, and we'll begin. Thank you. Stanley?
Good evening. You'll understand this is a little difficult to do because we just came from this incredible event. I'm going to show recent work to sort of set the stage of what I hope to discuss with Paul. And in so doing, I'm going to show 8 projects that are broken into 4 categories. There are 2 projects in each category. There is, as you know, in literary criticism today, a crisis in language. It extends to architecture as well. Architects are as concerned about their roots as are others, and in so doing, attempt to verify their existence, who they are. Part of how that's achieved is through that verification process, is to look at the past, much like the Renaissance. All of this is based on the fact that what I write and my involvement in teaching and my work are in a way one and the same thing. And so I will show projects that attempt to describe the boundaries about which we are all attempting to find who we are. So with that, let me just have the lights and maybe I can go through this. Do I do the lights? If you could focus the slide, sometimes they're going to not be concomitant one to the other. These first projects are a part of my interest in trying to find out for myself the nature of literalism, of representationalism. How far can one go to deal with something that is from an earlier time? How mimetically inclined can one be in one's work? How literal and representational can one be? We are doing, as you will see, it's now complete. It's the first Hard Rock Cafe, perhaps without a Cadillac protruding out of it. So we did the Hard Rock Cafe in Chicago. The Hard Rock Cafe in Chicago is interesting in part because its owner is from Chicago, its founder, that is. It began in London. He wanted to do something that was reminiscent of London. There is in Chicago, contrary to popular belief of either Sullivan, Wright, Mies, etc., the Chicago schools 1 and 2, a great building stock of neo-Georgian architecture. So what we did was a Georgian orangerie, attempting to relate the building that we did to an existing but unused Commonwealth Edison, our version of Con Ed, power station in the city, which is a very beautiful building, which was neo-Georgian, and I think I have a slide of it. And everything about, if you could just keep them focused as we go one to the other, because I'm not always sure they're going to be in focus. No, that's it. That's better anyway. So everything about that neo-Georgian building, which is to the left of what you see here on the bottom, informed it. That is the registration, the fact it was used the language of Tuscan architecture, etc. That is the Neo-Georgian building. It is the wrong side of it. The front is on the other side, which is far more beautiful, which has a more pronounced Palladian window. It also has stone medallions and so forth. It acted as an anchor. What we're looking at as a cross street in this slide is Ontario, one of the connectors to the expressway system and an exit of the city in a way. And it forms a gateway, in a sense, out of the city, together with that Romanesque building, neo-Romanesque building done by Henry Ives Cobb, a well-known Chicago architect at the turn of the century. So this building informed that building. Well, we had no idea this is a model of it. However, this is not a model of what you just saw. Commonwealth Edison then had a competition to do a new enlarged substation, and we won it. And so we are now building the context that informed the Hard Rock Cafe and so there's a certain distance on irony, I suppose, in all that. It's enhanced, the ironic component is enhanced when you consider that the building on the right, which has people of a sort anyway, that the building is a real study in dissimulation. The building is made out of Drive-It, which is a material like stucco that is put on over styrofoam. It's the only building in Chicago that actually could be burgled with a butter knife. But in any case, is a dissimulating object. The building on the left is authentic. It is made of the best brick in English crossbond, in limestone, with jack arches, no lintels, but of course there are no people, there are simply machines. So there's the Hard Rock. That is one of our exercises trying to come to grips with the language of architecture, the only language that we have known before invention took over. Now, the problem with language, of course, obviously, is that when one uses the language in its pure form, it pretends as if nothing has transpired in the interim. It also suggests a kind of disillusionment of presence. But carrying on with another project also engaged in attempting to deal with a past and a context. This is a house in Palm Beach. It's actually far more than a house. It's more like the Getty Museum, but it is a large house, suffice it to say. The ocean is there. It has tennis courts, an indoor pool, and saltwater pool, and so forth and so on. And it was informed in many ways by the presence of the past of Addison Meisner, who was a brilliant architect in the teens and 20s and early 30s in Palm Beach, who managed to convey a sense of the past, of what he sensed of a Spanish mission style, of a Spanish Georgian, a kind of architecture that was also regionally responsive, every bit as much as it was responsive to Palladian formal overtures and the hills of Tuscany beyond. This project continues in that tradition. One can safely say that it doesn't break new ground, but that it, in its gentility, it intends or attempts to convey a degree of responsibility with the past. So these are study models. We are in a continuing process of design, and these are wonderful opportunities for me personally to engage in study of the kinds of things that I was not trained, I did not study in my preparation to become an architect. However, having gone through that, there is another side to architecture which is properly unconcerned about conveyance of language. If Ortega y Gasset was correct when he stipulated that in the 15th century there were two kinds of art, one for the court, which was abstract, intellectual, distilled, and one for the people, that was accessible, recognizable, comfortable, and all of that. There's another side to architecture which is intrinsically of itself. That is to say, that contends, and what I mean by itself, contends with measurement alone. In other words, there is no science semiotically of the presence of its function, of its cost, of its site, of its context, of the traditions that preceded, the antecedent forms, and so forth. This is a project that deals with that subject. This is a showroom that was built for Formica, a corporation at the Merchandise Mart. It's very small. It has nothing to do with anything except measurement. All of the elements are, you will see by the next project, the reason why, represented by the cubit, the biblical dimension from the elbow to the extended finger, nominally a half meter. And then a secondary grid is superimposed at 45 degrees to the first, or 1.414 of the first, and one grid is black, one grid is white, and as one cleaves their way through that showroom, developing a kind of maze in a way, I suppose. At those points of cleavage, all of the samples of formica in all of the various colors are there. So it has nothing to do, this is a material that is normally one associates with the cladding of lecterns or kitchen cabinets or some other thing extrinsic to the product. In this case, it says that there is value intrinsically in the product, and that there's a kind of object of desire, which is the product itself. And so this is as far removed for me personally from the earlier projects as I can possibly get. It's what you will normally see in an evening with architects is one architect or another conveying one or another side of these coins. I, for reasons that escape me or that I am sufficiently unshrunk to go into publicly, am able to distance myself sufficiently so that I attempt to do all of these things. Because it's important for me, if I am to continue to do what I do, to find out the limits, the parameters of where it is we operate. So this is the converse of the other. So it is that grid. And then finally, the object of desire is the place that contains all of these samples, okay? Another project dealing with that is a synagogue we are currently engaged in working on in a suburb with a not particularly large constituency between Libertyville and Lake Forest in Illinois. And it's a very interesting project, as you'll see. These are at the bottom reconstructions of Solomon's temple with the two well-known columns, Yakin and Boaz, described in 1 Kings 5 through 9. They are shown with respect to that particular Egyptian temple and its obelisks for obvious reasons, the perhaps carrying of cultural baggage during Exodus to another land. But in all events, that temple, the Temple of Solomon, up to the time of Herod and its several iterations of Zerubbabel, of Ezekiel's unbuilt vision in anticipation of a messianic age, finally of Herod's citadel, represent a certain thrust in the Jewish religion. In a post-Herodian epoch, another thrust was the synagogue. The synagogue is very different from the temple. The synagogue, where the temple is by definition, by description, whether it's in the tractate of Ezekiel's chapter 40 to 43 or in 1 Kings, it contends with orientation. It, among other things, faces east. The synagogue is less concerned with orientation. It faces generally toward Jerusalem. This is an early example in Belarusia of a synagogue. It also has a certain primitive and very different characteristic. This congregation bought this log cabin, which is a very large building, which turns out to be oriented from the place that it's sited to Jerusalem. It is a building that is fully parged, happens currently to be owned by your former speaker's tonight's partner's sister-in-law, who sold it to this particular congregation. And so the congregation asked me to look at the house. It's a small world. And I did, and I discovered this orientation. I also discovered an extraordinary interior of this fully logged building. And so the idea was to using the building as phase one, then how would one flesh it out? So I made this drawing as a conceptual drawing which shows the original log cabin and its orientation, and thought of it as the sacred space surrounded by the lower elements of the Temple of Solomon, with the two columns, though evacuated, though it still shows the columns, the capitals and so forth. So that's fabulous, thanks. So this is a drawing of the plan. And this is the existing synagogue. It turns out that the synagogue is so, as it exists, though its entrance from its use as a house is here, its entrance, when seen in this light through its the proper orientation in a way, happens to be the size in cubits almost exactly of the porch of the temple as described in 1 Kings. And the entirety of this space, which then, this is all double height, and is the sacred space with the bima at this point, happens to be the size, I mean, it's 20 by 40 cubits. And the ark is here, the bima is there. The ark is informed by the word. They currently, in this particular congregation, take the Torah in ceremonial ways and walk around before taking it to the bima in any case. In all events, it is informed by the light and the knowledge of the word, which is in the library up above. The rabbi is there and his study is there. And the secular space is the classrooms, where bar mitzvah celebrations and so forth are conducted, are there. And the interim space, the interstices between it, can be interpreted, not intended as a pun. So the building in elevation is that log cabin with the 2 columns properly sized without their capitals and evacuated. After all, one remembers in Herod's case that the text was missing. This is the lowest elements of the temple, and then up above is a trillage. Actually, it's for sukkahs, but it is also designed as a kind of scaffold in anticipation of a messianic age, so that both theologies, it's a double theology in a certain way, where both are present and are made present through their orientation in a garden which represents many things, the tribes, the 30 guards, and so forth. So the double orientation is there, the trellis above, and so forth. I am doing a book on the architecture of exile, which happened to be going on at the same time. It preceded our being commissioned to do this, and it engages in it puts all of the reconstructions of all of the temples of the Jews up to Herod's time, inclusive in one text. In any case, the third way that I contend with my work. So one has the sort of the trace of the past, but in this abstract concept of gridding, of measurement. One has the literal or representational side, the 2 sides one finds present in their extreme forms today. And there's a third way, which I have worked on for a long time, which is to take that which is representational and to dispense with it. And in other words, by cleaving it, by breaking it, by rupturing it into 2. So this is a house which is a 9-square house with a circular element. One only has missing the Leonardo da Vinci figure to understand the utopian intention. And then that house is in turn cleaved and signed with these 2 obelisks or columns in the front, the upper plan of that house. It's not important to go into functionally what the house is by nuclear. There's a whole other set of art. It works. They're happy. The house, however, is in its ordinariness is then cleaved, which is what is conveyed. This house is now under construction and will be done, I guess, the end of next summer. And the center section, which is the break through the house, that's thought to be an outside space. It's an indoor pool, but it's so designed as an outside space. And the section taken in the other side. And then the other project in the same line of breaking, of rupturing the presence of the past in a way, of rupturing a literal or representational amplification or verification of where we have been, is a project that I'm doing in Berlin as a part of a series of urban villas designed by other architects as well. I think Bob Stern, Paolo Portoghese, Ada Grumbach from Paris, etc. We were all given the same program. It's 16 meters on a side. It's so high, it breaks at the same angle. They all have copper roofs. What to do? There were 6 flat buildings. They're 3 stories. And what we did was to make a building as conventionally as we could in the context of a Middle European Berliner building, using Mies van der Rohe's first Pearl's house of 1909 as the antecedent figure, and then to rupture that building. In other words, as you'll see, the building is incredibly conventional, but then to actually break it into two, so that the building, which is tripartite, has a rusticated stone, is in the colors of the German flag, I might add, a yellow stucco, red grid. And that grid, which then ruptures and bisects the center, becomes the mullionization of the building. In other words, it is as if the building, which appears authentic in its tripartite top to bottom and three bay left to right, and then in turn ruptured by that grid, is then also becomes the structure of that building. So that the building is not, I mean, this is the conventional side of the building. But even on the conventional side, it's as if the building is made up of its own grid rather than a deeper structure. That grid, in turn, is, when transgressed, to simply get into the apartments. I mean, it also acts as a block party place and is clad up above in Lexan, in plexiglass. In all events, the presence of the grid, which also happens to be a cubit, so there is that building. So the building on the one hand is conventional, I mean, it has a double reading, and then it's broken, etc. Okay, the last two projects I'm going to show are my own interest, not in synthesis, because I have none, but in an American indigenous or vernacular architecture where the distinct or literal sign of the language of the building is reduced into almost a mute state, where the building, by using the language of rural America, where an authentic indigenous American architecture has always been there, yet alone one relying on the use of the obvious European antecedent forms. This is a cottage that my wife, Margaret McCurry, who is an architect, and I did together for ourselves. It's our weekend house in Michigan. It has many references to the past. It has a lot of ties to an ecclesiastical architecture, as you'll see. But it is, in fact, based on an architecture where language is reduced and replaced, not synthesized, but replaced by a reading of an intrinsically indigenous and American type emanating from the land. Several strategies were employed to achieve that. The use of materials, it's all found objects, corrugated galvanized steel, the galvanized granary roof, all conventions that can be seen as a granary and a barn or a baptistry and a basilica, as you'll see. And all without the evidence of signing it through through language itself. In other words, it appears in a way where, as if just the structure and the use of the materials alone are enough to convey an image that's authentically of the country. It's a very little building, and is done in trellis on the ends, and then this corrugated, and using the devices of ventilation as an ornamental program, etc. The screen porch. The interiors is something else. The interiors are another attempt at language, of defining through a series of details and repetitiousness ways of conveying information through detailing. And so that's that. Finally, the last project is a weekend house in Connecticut for a New Yorker, which very much like, and in some ways informed by, though entirely different, like the earlier project, like the weekend house, is a residential accommodation that tries also to, while fitting into its pre-Revolutionary War context in that part of Connecticut, Western Connecticut, that it also is a reduced series of clues as to what makes this building. In all events, what's most interesting for me in a way is the organization of the plan, which looks back to Edwin Pryor in England at the turn of the century, who developed something called a butterfly plan, a house whose plan is made up of two rectangles, the intersection of the primary axes of which and the intersection of the secondary axes of which set up conditions or imply extensions beyond the building, so that the building is not the answer, that the building in nature is a part of the answer, beyond the clues of the building itself, that the answers are somewhere out in nature. This house is actually being photographed tomorrow, though I have some crude photographs taken by my partner when he was supervising on one visit. The house is broken into two distinct pieces, cleaved two rectangles with this sacred space in the center, which is a study up above, but which runs right through the building. So these kinds of buildings, without specifically engaging in a literal attempt to convey their roots and our roots, rely more upon the nature of the land to suggest their own authenticity, the model of it, and then the house. There are certain Jeffersonian and other attempts to use the concept of exaggeration in terms of drainage and other devices in an ornamental program, but none of these are within the conventions of the literal use of the classical language of architecture. These are the four things that fascinate me, and these are examples of projects that maybe one can digress and discuss. Thank you.
Are we ready? We're real. Okay. Thank you. As I said, I think the format was smoother before the Y was rich enough to have such grand equipment. Thank you for your patience. Let me begin by looking back, Stanley, before the projects you showed here, at your book, your published book, Versus. One chapter heading of which was Postmodernism is a Jewish Movement. Where better but the Y to ask you to tell us something about what that means?
I knew you had to get to it. Certainly at the 92nd Street Y. What I meant by that is that architecture, I think I said in the book, is essentially Platonic. Right. That is, it deals with vertical priorities and hierarchies where one says that this is better than that. It is more Platonic than it is Aristotelian, let's say. It doesn't engage in dialectic, where one uses such things as the golden section and other mythic numerical ratios to convey a sense of propriety, authenticity, and so forth. Postmodernism, which is the upside of postmodernism, one of its constituent features is its analytic, dialectical, Aristotelian, Talmudic questioning without interest particularly in resolution, but really to engage, almost as European education has done for many years, in a kind of dialectical reasoning. And I don't mean dialectical Hegelian reasoning that comes to a synthesis, but an unresolved dialectic. And I think that postmodernism is, in that way, very Jewish, in the sense that it questions, it doesn't attempt to establish beauty as an essential condition, a specific vision of beauty. It removes, or reduces at least, Paul, the notion of one perfect ideal way of making something. And it says, I mean, the excessive use of the word pluralism,
Right.
the way in which one does it one way and one does it another way. And so you saw in this work, I looked to see where the screen went, but I mean, in that work that was shown up there, my own attempt to come to grips with the several sides of what I construe this time to be about, one of which is trying to find its roots, and thereby the classical language of architecture. It is like the English language, the only one we know. But the downside of it and of postmodernism suggests that through verification there's a disillusionment of the present, and so therefore one wishes to engage almost blindly in the present to find out what is intrinsic to it without being weighted down by the baggage of language. And so I think that those things are arguments which I then, in those last two sections, quote unquote, try not to synthesize, but to try and take from different points of view again. It is one of the terrific things that the Jesuits and Talmudic scholars do, is to simply, study. And that's unusual to architecture. And I think that postmodernism, that's what I meant by that
Right.
statement.
Judaism certainly has an absence of direct answers as part of it. That's, in fact, what you say is the absence of utopianism in a way.
Right.
Does that mean that we can construe modernism as a Catholic movement? Or
No, I think that modernism, very much like all of the other movements, the reason it tied itself to Gothic architecture was that there was a pure right way using
Right.
structure to find an answer,
Right.
the answer they submitted. And so I think that that answer had an ideal resonance to it, which they took to be the truth. And I think that modernists were zealots. I think that the Gothic architects were zealots, and they're searching for God through buildings that were spires that sought a heavenly, a divine intersection. And I think that modernists were the same thing. I don't think it was Catholic particularly.
Right.
I think it was Catholic, if you wish. It was Catholic to the extent that, like Christianity, which displaces argument or dialectic or reasoning
with a kind of catechism,
with
an
a belief
absolute
system,
dictate,
with a
absolute belief
belief
system,
with
exactly.
something called
Yeah.
faith.
Right.
So that modernists had faith. They had faith in the future. The upside of modernism was an optimistic sense that without which one cannot simply be an architect. I would submit you can't believe in the bomb and be an architect. I mean, how long can you analyze and sort of dialectically engage until you find, listen, I really do believe that it is proper, as Heidegger tried to point out in the use of the word bauen linguistically, or build it, to dwell in peace, to exist, to be. And I think that architecture is that too. But I think that until one questions that, I mean, to have that faith alone, which is enough to a point, without questioning it is problematic. To question it in a complete absence of that faith, I think is problematic, is not architectural either. I think all of these things are the upside of postmodernism, are the sides that made us question all of our values again. It's obviously a romantic notion. It's not a classical idea. It's a romantic idea.
Oh, I think postmodernism, despite its heavy reliance on the classical language, uses it in a fundamentally romantic way.
Yeah.
I mean, the impulse behind it is clearly romantic. What about the theme that's preoccupying you right now, at least in your writing, of exile? The idea that, this takes off from what you just began to say, that this is a time without much faith and confidence in itself or in the future. That we look to the past because we do not believe in a future.
Right.
Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, over a bowl of soup an hour or so ago, we were talking a bit about this. Giamatti, I guess the head of the National League now, in a book entitled Exile and Change in Renaissance Literature, wrote about, you citing examples of writings by Petrarch of Shakespeare and so forth, Spencer, about how the Renaissance was the first epoch, in a way, that looked behind itself for verification to an earlier time to verify itself. When you look to another time, and of course I would submit, and I do in this book, that this is a time of exile, that like the Renaissance, we too look backward to an earlier time for verification. When you look back to another time, to an ideal place, what you are saying in a way is that you're in exile, since the constituent feature of exile, I believe, is the desire to be in a place other than the one that you're at. I mean, the belief system that you are at home. I mean, George Steiner wrote this fabulous piece in Salamagundi a year ago entitled Our Homeland, the Text, wherein he takes off on Solomon's temple saying that the Davidic and Solomonic edifice may have been an erratum, a misreading of the transcendent mobility of the text. In other words, by building a building which would house a text that was intrinsically exegetic and interpretive, that it fixed it wrongly. And this book, my book, expands upon that dramatically, where perhaps the only proper architectural home for the Torah was the tent, because of its mobility intrinsically as a piece of architecture. That once you fixed it in brick and mortar and so forth and so on, I mean, in a certain way, you're fixing the text, but the text is not fixed, the text is interpreted. So in any case, I think this is a time of exile. If you look backward to another time, this is not a time of great courage. It is not a time that leaps into black holes and moves forward. It looks backward for verification. When you look backward for verification, engaging in what is called circular narrative, like the Torah, once upon a time, textuality in that sense is narrative and cyclical and complete. And so this is that kind of time. I'm trying to explain it in the book as bumblingly as I know the English language, to make a case for that in architectural terms, using, I mean, obviously if you're going to examine exile, you're going to examine the temples of the Jews. And so by putting them all under one roof, so to speak, and attempting to analyze them, the book, which in its 4 parts explains its wholeness, the first part is called the sign, the second part is called the challenge, the third part is called displacement, and the fourth part is called exile. And all of the temples of the Jews move forward up to that point, and I attempt to explain it. I think this is a time of exile.
Is there not a real qualitative difference, given this theory, between architecture in this time that attempts to move completely backwards to a literal historicism, such as, say, Alan Greenberg's or some of the recent work of Bob Stern, and architecture that takes as its fundamental concept the idea of synthesis, of collage, of collaging various historical periods that may or may not have ever, in fact, had anything to do with each other, thereby defining itself as of the present as much as of the past, in that the act of collage is itself something that can only be done, in effect, at the end of history, looking back at all of this. I mean, do you...
I'm much more interested in the work of Quinlan Terry and, and Greenberg.
Quinlan Terry and Greenberg fit your theory better. That's
because they're more literally engaged in attempting to declaratively examine language straight away, without attempting to hybridize it immediately. I mean, the great impulse and the great seduction in architecture is to hybridize, is to synthesize, is to make an amalgam.
What's wrong with synthesis?
I think there's nothing wrong with synthesis, but when things are synthesized, if a client comes to you and says, I would like a house that should cost this and do this and fit that thing and contextually be this and so on, and upon examination you find that one or another of these isn't a fit, one often uses the word synthesis to suppress one in favor of another. So you will find that most buildings that are, in quotes, synthesized,
Well,
that
but
are
if we're talking about
ingested.
just aesthetic synthesis, never mind the other issues that are part of architecture.
What would you consider a building that is aesthetically synthesized?
Aesthetically synthesized. I'll say the work of Graves, without passing judgment on it at the moment. Let's just take a building by Michael Graves like Cumana or Portland. Clearly is looking backwards, but it's not looking backwards literally. It's looking backwards to a past that never was, and filtering it so clearly and absolutely through the lens of modernism that and pulling together strains that are not really the same. And I see cubism there as much as I see classicism, as much as I see heaven knows what else, but
all
it is
of
certainly synthetic.
Okay, but all of these, yes, I think that Graves' work is synthetic, and I think that I happen to like it, but I think that in the rush to synthesize, I think that often the examination, the analysis of work, which is what I was getting at in this postmodernism being a Jewish movement, the analyzing of the stuff before one rushes to synthesize it, should take the longest possible time to see where the boundaries are before the rush to synthesize. For example, by synthesizing, all of the things that you mentioned that Michael does, which I think are right, and they are, of course, Cubist because of his earlier preoccupations, his interest in Egyptian and Greek and Roman, his time at the American Academy and so forth. But they may be synthesized, but there is nothing of the present. There is nothing of the present as future other than the distance that he can attain from the past through hybridizing several things and reducing their evidence, let's say. Now, rather go to the work of Eisenman, which is not a synthesis at all. Eisenman, I would submit, is the exact corollary and almost identical to Leon Krier in a certain way, as his opposite, where one's belief is rooted in the authenticity of the past, the other's work is rooted in the belief systems of a post-Holocaust, post-nuclear age, and the hopelessness implied, and the simple and the absolute abstract utter removal of any evidence of antecedent form. I think that both of them are pure strains of a breed which are far more fascinating to me than Michael's work. Michael Graves is a wonderful architect that, as any connoisseur can see, is the work of an incredibly, indelibly gifted man. But I don't see in it the promise upon examination for places for the rest of us to go. Okay? In the work of Greenberg and Terry and all of those people, in the work of Eisenman and Tschumi and Libeskind over there, there are places for us to go. And that I find far more fascinating than those who would be quick to rush to hybridize.
It's fascinating, and yet what you're saying is it is more valid to say the past means everything or the past means nothing than it is to say the past means something but not everything.
Well, no, I think that when you say that the past means something but there is no evidence of the future in the work of the author that's engaged in that hybrid, then that author has achieved a certain distance or irony, I would submit. That takes away, it's as if his viscera has been removed from his body. Okay? I could say that about Michael. I mean, because there is an absence of an intense passion in the work. And I think that I think architecture is also passion.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that anybody engaged in literally examining and working his or her way through the classical language here or through the abstruse thing of measurement here, that takes a certain passion.
Where would you say Venturi fits into this?
I think he's achieved the same distance, for sure. I think that the generation of American architects, sort of fathered by Venturi in a way, have achieved a kind of distance. It's almost as if we're embarrassed finally to grow up, I think, to say that it's not that our antecedents no longer count, that Europe no longer counts, but I think that there is something in trying to find an authentically American architecture that doesn't only come from another place. That's my interest in the language of the farm, the vernacular, indigenous, non-architectural types, where language has already been reduced where the ecclesiastical the language of the church has been taken into the farm, been taken into account in the design of farms and rural things. I think those are interesting things. I'm not about to say, in fact, all of these people are incredibly gifted and really good architects, and it's not my job or place or interest at all to deprecate them. I just don't think that one can learn from it as much as one can from these other things, as we all push to find an authentically American architecture.
Let's move a little more toward your own work. There's something in, I suppose, more in your earlier work, or your middle period, your post-Miesian work, than in the very current work, but to some extent in the current work too. I'm struck by an almost discordancy or disparity between the profundity and passion of the ideas, the intellectual stance that it represents, and a consistent degree of playfulness in the final forms. How do those two things jibe? How is it that an architecture that begins with principles as profound ends up with a built form that is in so many ways so playful?
There's only so much you can explain. I mean, there's another, Frank Gehry, who is, bless him, a wonderful architect, spent a weekend with us this summer, and it happened to be that weekend in the New York Times that Jack Nicholson, there was an article on him or something, and Frank, I guess, shared a bachelor pad with him in Malibu one time, a long time ago. And Nicholson was quoted as saying that he never gives away anything. And he internalizes it and just does it and never talks about it before and never talks about it after. And Frank said to me, that's your problem. You tell everything. You tell it all. The thing is, on this other aspect of playfulness, I don't know. I mean, I never really thought, it's sort of like my body. I can't get it right. I can't explain it. Christ, I can't explain everything, Paul.
You did.
On the one hand, you're accusing me, saying,
I'm not accusing you of anything.
You have all these sort of intellect, these kind of rationales for what you do, but what about this other? Do you really have this other thing under control too? No, I don't.
Okay. This is not an accusation at all, but it's true that you are the only man in America who is, so far as I know, who has designed one house called Animal Crackers, another house with a phallic floor plan. They're both kind of neat houses. They don't particularly jibe with the philosophical stance that you presented, that's all.
Neither does the fact that I used to play piano in a strip joint before jibe with it either.
If I'd known that, I wouldn't have let them move the piano away so fast.
A part of the believability of any of us is our inconsistencies. And I think that a lot of the ideas that I am engaged in obviously get ingested into a body and a mind and a memory based on many, many things, some of which come out in ways that are not always concomitant with what's in the frontal lobes, shall we say.
Was it the frontal or other lobes that led you, when you were doing a studio at Yale a couple of years ago, to assign the students to design a slaughterhouse?
Did you see Seltzer's thing that was just published called The Slaughterhouse in Via? It's in a new book of his, Richard Seltzer.
Right.
I have always been interested in death, in another side. I have always been interested in the sides that architects are not conventionally interested in. I'm interested in death, in prisons, in the dark side that is never talked about in a discipline which professes its belief in systems, in faith of life after death. And frankly, in a philosophical Christian operation of which I am neither trained, neither engaged in. And so I've always been interested. You may not be aware that Dudok did an abattoir. It was only published once. These things don't get published a lot. I wanted to see what Yaleys would do with it. There's a funny story. I also, of course, I teach at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I gave the problem simultaneously to kids in Chicago who are generally from poorer families, lower IQ, work much harder, and Yaleys who, like Siamese cats, generally will die of thin blood pneumonitis and overbreeding. And so I gave these problems at once, and the kids from Chicago were genuinely, I forced both groups to go to a slaughterhouse in the beginning. And the kids from Chicago went to this slaughterhouse and were terrified and were frightened I went with both groups, and were really upset and really got into the problem. The kids from Yale found a slaughterhouse in Branford, and they went out as a kind of funeral cortege, car after car, right? And that slaughterhouse was also had to be a butcher shop, and then afterward bought veal for a sort of little dinner they were doing. You know. So some things are predictable.
You're right. You really didn't even have to finish the studio after that, did you? I mean, you knew everything.
But Richard Seltzer, for those of you that have never read the wonderful books that this surgeon who teaches and practices at the Yale Medical School, has written a number of wonderful books. He wrote this incredible piece in the Journal of the School of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania called VIA in the current issue, which is simply called The Slaughterhouse, and it's his description of being on that jury, because I asked him to be on that jury. And he was overcome with it. I mean, he had a very hard time with it.
He's a wonderful writer. Yeah. He's a very, very, very gifted writer. Let's talk about a figure whose name I don't think has been mentioned tonight at all, or if so, not more than once or twice, who's been crucial to your life, first as a kind of hero, then as a sort of anti-hero, which is Mies van der Rohe. You have, in a sense, been the almost a pivotal figure in the, I say, post-Miesian rather than anti-Miesian period in Chicago, seeking to rally the Chicago architectural community around the idea that there is life after Mies and there is more to architecture than Mies. Could you talk about not only your own evolution there, but also how it all looks now when we've all moved so far away from Mies that in the last year or two there's been a sense of even edging backwards again, or back more toward Mies in a lot of people's work and a lot of people's thinking?
The last show in this 100th year of his birth was the one at the Art Institute.
Which was very good, which was surprisingly good, I thought.
And you saw the catalog?
Yes.
Did you read the piece I wrote?
No. I apologize. I did not read the piece.
But it is, no,
if you like, we can suspend this evening until I go home, read it, and I will happily reconvene us after I've read it.
No, because
I
wrote, because what is in the piece and in the next piece that is in the next issue of Perspecta, but looks at it from a different angle. Mies is very much missed. I miss Mies. I miss his presence. Because he was an authentic. The descendants, for me, and I say it, were engaged in usury. They had no more interest. I mean, America has a way of making things practical. It takes ideas in their pure idea form, okay, often from Europe. That wonderful book, Exile in Paradise by Halbert, and then makes them usable, makes them practical, makes sense out of them. So these people saw in Mies a way not to extend language, not to attempt to ferret out the truth of Mies. In the 15 books that have been written, Paul, not one, including the book by Franz Schultz, the Rona Barrett Revelations of Mies's Mistresses, right? Not even that book engages at all in a development of the language of architecture that Mies employed. In other words, the repetitiousness, the serial measurement, the relationship, the taking beyond his well-known philosophical interests. All they did was to make buildings that appeared to be Miesian. That is to say, but you can always find the difference between the two.
Oh, sure.
The one is proportioned, the other is never proportioned, as you'll see in the article in Perspective, which shows Chase Manhattan here and the Federal Center here, and you see that the one is Golden Section and the other is just a bunch of stuff. Because obviously the other, nobody ever took the time to study seriously the issues of proportion.
And Chase is one of the better.
And the Chase is one of the better ones.
Of the post-museum building, sure.
So if you really examine one for one the buildings that came out, I mean, there's no way, Philip Johnson, there is no way that the house in New Canaan could have existed but for the Farnsworth House, by Philip's own admission, no doubt. Philip is not an original. He's medically inclined. Mies was the original.
Sure.
Okay? So you might fill out some cards for the night that he comes. So I say these things, and my anxieties have nothing to do with Mies. He was, I think, will be found to be the genuinely great architect of the 20th century, far transcending Le Corbusier. Obviously had a much greater impact on much lesser architects who found ways to exploit the use of measurement, repetitiousness, and the kind of mute language that Mies elevated into art, and without which became the commerce of Sixth Avenue and so forth and so on.
Well, it was all too easily translatable into a vernacular that, of course, did utter violence to everything Mies was truly about.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
So the impact of Mies was spectacular in Chicago, where there were 45 buildings authored by him. The impact of his descendancy is dreadful, and I continue to act out, if you like, in the face of that descendancy, of that canonical, sycophantic claque.
How strong is it still in Chicago?
What?
How strong is that sycophantic claque in Chicago at this point? It obviously got a certain shot of adrenaline from the centennial year this year.
Yeah, but I would say, I mean, the problem is that the greatest descendant force was Skidmore, Owings and Merrill.
Sure.
And its most powerful office was in Chicago, which is where the firm was founded. And when that firm has turned entirely away from Mies and engaged itself in the developing of the worst kind of postmodernism, as indeed they mostly engaged in the worst kind of Miesianism, then you can see that it has changed dramatically in Chicago.
Sure.
Not entirely for the better.
As we go on, let me call again for questions and ask the ushers if they can be a good time to begin bringing some cards our way as we continue to talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you find Chicago at this point is as lively an intellectual community architecturally as it was under Mies? More so, less so?
Far more so. Mies once said, build,
don't talk. Right.
And so nobody ever said anything. I mean, there was little interaction. There were no small firms. Some of the better students in the United States never came to Chicago at all to take up architecture. That's changed dramatically.
There was simply just one way to do things.
Well, also, another thing that's changed, and I figured it out the other day, there was only 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was only one architectural historian in Greater Chicago. It was Carl Condit, who was the technocratically inclined historian.
Right.
Now there are 8. David Van Zandt, who together with Drexler and Neil Levine did the
Beaux-Arts
show. John Zukowski, who heads the Art Institute. Bob Brugman and Martha Pollack at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Kevin Harrington trained at Cornell, at IIT, and on and on and on. And they've had actually a tremendous impact. We have the Chicago Architectural Club. We have the Graham Foundation. There is now the SOM Foundation, which I am on the board, which just selected Leon Creer as its first director. The University of Illinois in Chicago's Architecture School Lecture Series. So there is an incredible burst, actually for the very first time since the first Chicago Architectural Club at the turn of the century, founded by Wright and Howard Van Dorn Shaw. It's the first time that there's been kind of interaction.
Right.
It's a much more exciting place.
Good. Let's move to
Thanks, Laura.
some of your questions now, as more pour in at every moment. Thank you. Do you look backward for verification or for reevaluation to go forward with more awareness of what possibilities there are in the present? Is that clear?
No.
No, it was not actually.
But it's okay. I mean, on the one hand, by showing, I mean, obviously some of this work does look backward to attempt to find out, to figure out, to reckon with the things that precede us. To pretend that nothing transpired behind us is preposterous. So there is a certain of that, but I try and do it in as distilled a way as I can. There's another side of me that wants to simply reckon with our own time, however indistinguishable it is from another time, and however underexposed it is, and to try and expose it. And in order to do that, I don't think you need the baggage of what precedes you. And from that point, there are others who are well equipped to synthesize work. My interest is not so much in synthesis, for these reasons I gave an answer to the question about why postmodernism is a Jewish
Right.
movement.
Okay. You would have it that all modern architects were of one approach, one faith, to use your words. What about the diversity in the work of Aalto, Van Eyck, Breuer, Foster, Rogers, Jurgla, Gwathmey Siegel, and many others? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that, obviously these kinds of things in an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours to attempt to cover it all has a certain preposterous ring to it. Obviously that was just found out by that question. Nonetheless, while they all are uniquely different, those architects, some of whom are sort of proto-postmodernists. One would say that Aalto, who was engaged not in a synthetic architecture at all, nonetheless, the bulk of them, by rejecting the only language that was known, that is the classic language, and as Bob Stern would say, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, by disposing of it just like that and developing a tabula rasa, subjected themselves unnecessarily to a limited palette. Aalto was by far more than many of the others that are mentioned, the one who was more tied regionalistically to a vernacular set of origins. But it's like dispensing with the English language and saying, okay, let's start again, simply because the English language was taken up by fascists or by people who, by employing it, tainted that language. And I think that has a certain preposterousness to it.
Good. This question has a postscript, which actually I'm happy to read. It comes from Abe Geller, who says, I came here to hear Johnson, but I'm happy you substituted. You have even more architectural chutzpah than Johnson, and you are more amusing. Yeah. Thank you.
I like you too, Abe, and have for a very long time, as he knows.
Please comment on your work for Swid Powell. Do you feel that's, for those of you who don't know, the company that has risen to fame and fortune producing household objects, dishes, glasses, and so forth by celebrated architects. Do you feel that architects have been properly educated to design plates, salt and pepper shakers, and so forth?
Absolutely not.
I do like tiger paws.
Yes, thank you very much. We all like, if not playing with tchotchkes, with little things, Given a chance, I would design, like any architect, everything I could get my paws on. And the chance of designing, but are we trained? Absolutely not. I mean, most of the people, including yours truly, that designed the tea services for Alessi, you really wouldn't want to pour it because it mostly dribbles on your trousers. Okay? But if you like spending $18,000 for a silver tea service that dribbles on your trousers, it's cool. I really like designing this stuff. I think We designed fabrics, as did Michael Graves, for an outfit in Osaka. We designed jewelry together with Graves and Venturi and Eisman, which is just coming out for this Cleto Munari from Milan, and now another outfit called Acme in LA. I love doing it. I mean, I think that designing, we started to do some stuff for a Knoll, some rockers, and then for Miller and Barcalounger. I mean, we've had a lot of aborted attempts at this. It's a great deal. It's not fun. It's very difficult. Those kinds of design problems are very hard. To design this stuff is extremely difficult. And it's much harder to get away with murder doing this than this. And so given the chance, I love doing it. But are we trained? No. Will I do it continuously? Yes, if asked.
Did I actually hear you say Barcalounger?
Yeah, we did a great pair of Barcaloungers. We were asked to do a Barcalounger, and I couldn't help doing three, a Doric, Ionic, and a Corinthian Barcalounger. It seemed like the right, obviously they didn't go ahead. Most of my work has a self-defeating component in it.
I mean, can we find them down at Siemens or whatever?
As I said, it mostly has a self-defeating component.
Okay.
They remained on the shelf.
What about the danger that this phenomenon will lead us toward more and more of a sense of architecture as fashion? You know, the architect as fashion designer cum celebrity.
Of course, you're disarmingly attempting to convey that modernism was not at one point in fashion.
No, we're not talking about sort of the larger questions of being in fashion, but more of the idea that it is fashion, meaning it is sort of superficial trend, easily changed, replaced, disposed of, what have you.
But I see the tea services and buildings and furniture exactly in the same light. I think that I don't think it's any more fashionable to do that than Mies very carefully husbanding and orchestrating his own career, I would submit, made sure that he did all of the furniture, regardless that it wasn't commercially available when Shu Knoll and Hans Knoll bought it. It showed up in all of his buildings in the late 40s in any case, and was made individually in Chicago, and Corbu the same. I think that architects still suffer from the total edifice complex of doing it all, inhabiting it all, sitting on it, eating from it, etc., etc. That their women wear it and that they wear it and it's everywhere. Okay, architects are not team players. You must ask their ex-wives. They are not very good at playing on teams. So therefore, they do this. It's virtuoso performance. They do it all by themselves. It's an autodidactic operation.
Is there not a point at which it could lead to sort of the licensing of names, like Bill Blast chocolates? I mean, I mean, obviously the seriousness with which you perform the act of designing a tea service, a piece of furniture, whatever, belies this. But one wonders if the larger cultural social movement toward name identification on objects can lead us to that.
And it definitely, I think it probably will. I mean, it will happen exactly in the same
along the way.
No, not at all. I think it'll happen exactly in the same way that Mies as an authentic original was used by the descendants. Certainly, there will be things for a really mass consumption get watered down, absorbed, and developed, and expanded upon by others.
Very different question. Next month, the LA County Museum will open its new contemporary wing, followed by the opening of Isazaki's Museum of Contemporary Art, and then the announcement of Richard Meyer's Getty design. Of all the new museum projects this decade, which one would you have most liked to have had a crack at, and why? Interesting that this questioner mentions two of the three architects involved in those three projects and not Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer, which designed the LA County Museum. Anyway, can you respond?
Well, the one that they didn't mention is the one that I thought was the best, which was Frank Gehry's Temporary Contemporary in LA. And that's the one I would have liked to have done, because I think that the idea of contemporaneity, of every contemporary museum, I look at the one in Chicago, I look at the modern, which is hardly modern any longer, etc. I would much rather be involved and engaged in doing a museum of the present, a museum that, has the goal to suggest that there is something ahead of us, as opposed to a repository. Gary's Temporary Contemporary, I thought, dealt with that subject beautifully. I mean, even the use of the language, temporary, contemporary. That's the one I would have loved to have done.
Good. You would not, I trust, have turned down the Getty, however, had it come your way.
No, but I learned a lesson actually from Mies a long time ago, when once in his office, 20 years ago, and seeing him talking to the corporate membership of the Krupp Works, who had apparently asked him to do their headquarters in Germany, and he looking at a chart and saying, "Yeah, I can begin the project in 3 years." And I suddenly realized what that meant, that he didn't hire and fire people like they were so many pieces of paper. We now, I won't even knock on wood, are sufficiently busy that I no longer take projects. I now put people in line. I have no interest in expanding. You're saying that I wouldn't turn them down. No, I wouldn't turn them down. I would put them in line. If they didn't want to stay in line, I'm happy to say goodbye. I'm not interested in expanding. I'm not interested in success in the conventional sense. The reason I've always admired Abe Geller and Abe Geller's work is because he has always acted exactly in that way. I find that very interesting in the way that Paul Rudolph and others have conducted themselves. I find that interesting. I'm not interested in success in building up 50, 60, 80, 200 man firms. So accepting the job, not particularly.
Great. Good answer. Thank you. How can one sense an absence of passion in Graves's work? What reveals that absence? And didn't the passionate zealotry of modernism lead to a sterile dead end?
Questioner's got strong views. I think that Graves's absence of passion is that which is always found present in the sign of the connoisseur. I think that Michael Graves is a really first-rate connoisseur who knows from where he draws very well and is able to distance himself through that. I think intellectual distance is the sign of the connoisseur. I don't think that he is passionately engaged. His work doesn't bear the sign of passion for me, personally. That doesn't mean that the work is less than brilliant, because it is not less than brilliant. To then digress and say that modernism led to a dead end, I don't really find the logic connected to it. I don't know, there is a theory that modernism led to a dead end, of course, but I don't know what it has to do with this.
I presume the questioner means sort of what good did all that passion get us? The passion that was involved in the origins of modernism.
Yeah, I think the passions of modernism were its very best aspect and should not be connected to the evidence of the remains, of what one sees in the work. It was the advocacy in the belief systems of an optimistic...
More mail delivery, that's all.
Of an optimistic way of dealing with life, and saying that with the Russian Revolution came a certain optimism, that one could believe in a future where the past had so encumbered one in every way possible. And I think that led to a lot of passion. And I think that passion, that advocacy of its work, not distanced from the work, is modernism's especially vulnerable and poetic condition.
The depth and breadth of your literary and philosophical bent is evident when you discuss your work. How is a layperson to approach your buildings without a knowledge of such references or language? It's a good question.
It's a very good question. Obviously, authors don't stand next to buildings or books. But authors try very hard to put into the work enough substance, hoping somewhere someone will connect with something. And that's my hope, along with lots and lots of architects. And so we use what little intellectual pretensions that we have to load up the work so that you and others and I with other authors can go to it, and maybe there's something that we'll get. We try like hell to do that, and hoping that something will be received.
You spoke about the non-verbal application of American architecture, as shown in your own weekend house. Do you feel that this Americanism has a place in urban design?
See, that's what's great about the 92nd Street. Why these are great questions. That's a hard question. There are two theories about Eden. One, that it was sacred, and one, that it was profane. And that if it was sacred, how come Adam and Eve disobeyed God? And is the city the sacred center now? In other words, has God sufficiently been displaced in a post-Nietzschean world to say that this is the sacred center? Can you no longer attach types from agrarian original form? These are issues that I think are worth speculating about. It is, once removed from the city, the language of rural America, the farm, the barn, the granary, those things, they metaphorically tied to ecclesiastic architecture, as I tried to talk a little bit about in my own our own weekend house. But it's very difficult to try and attach that to the city. I'm not sure about the city as it has become. The city of the Hellenic distant past, a city that one could, by Greek definition, by seeing its edges, understand it and grasp it. The city is no longer in our grasp in a way. There is a yearning within architecture and architectural academic institutions to clarify what we call typology, urban types, that is categories, to make the city more clear. You have done it in some ways, or Alex Cooper did it in some ways, not necessarily the architects that worked there, in Battery Park, because there is a perceivable typology. There is a perceivable, understandable, comprehensible series of categories that you understand what is housing and where are workers and so forth. And those may be in cities of far greater consequence, with the exception of the Whitney museums and figural buildings, what used to be called foreground buildings. That typological comprehensibility, understandability, is I think where it's at in cities. That those forms emanate from another time or from the country, I think is quite possible. If you look back at the work of Otto Wagner and his descendants of the Hof, the superblock in Vienna, like the Karl Marx Hof, they're very understandable, and their typology immediately relates back to the country of gathering the wagons round and all of that. Mm-hmm. I think there is a comprehensibility. It isn't just so evident. I intend to pursue that. That's why I think that's incredible. That's actually the best question, because a question that talks about the nature of cities, talks about our time, ties with it the sense of an original and so forth.
Good. Here's another good question. Your exile argument is very interesting, but as a modern phenomenon, it is not without precedent. And in fact, I submit, more often than not, since actually I'm having trouble reading this one, since frequently architecture has borrowed from forms of the past. Extending your assertion, is not the feeling of exile a permanent human condition? And if so, how can architecture avoid this and still maintain relevance to the general population that uses architecture?
Exactly. But that's been the problem with architecture, because architecture, by tying it to a perpetual belief system in life after death, and thereby, as the mullah for the Muslim, by uttering the word jihad, suggesting that if dying in a war against the infidels, one is assured a place to the right of Allah, that there is a belief held forth in something after death. And I think that's fabulously put. That's the problem. I mean, I think that our belief systems, as demonstrated by the buildings that we build, tend to be rooted in beliefs of life after death. I'll give you an example. For me, it's purely personal. Easily the most spectacular monument that I have ever seen is the Vietnam Memorial, for me. Why? It is of our time. The rest of the monuments are white, vertical, phallic, and above ground, seeking heaven, engaging once again in life after death, and all of that. The Vietnam Memorial is black, it is below ground, it cleaves the ground, it is of our time, of that war, and it brings ultimately great dignity upon us all in a certain real way. And I think that once our own beliefs are less awed by beliefs in life after death, and as opposed to the absolute love of living, and that the buildings that one builds, designs, inhabits, and so forth represent that to us as they have done in favor of images of life after death, I think it's a very different society. I think it's a terrific question.
It is indeed. Here's an intriguing, if less profound question. How do you define architecture versus interior design? Where do you draw the line, if at all?
Well, I am one of the few architects that long before it was fashionable felt that interior designers, I will go a step further, that interior decorators had a far greater sense of connoisseurship than architects trained as a product of the modern movement. When architects were trained in the École des Beaux-Arts system, when they actually learned something, then I would say that there was of some value to attain an architectural education as opposed to an apprenticeship. The modern movement kind of killed that educationally and displaced it with a sense of intrinsic virtuosity within the performer, as author, as student. The interior decorator, the interior designer, if one ever were to look at the difference between the state examination to become a registered architect and the interior design examination, where you actually have to know very precisely historical phenomena and so forth and so on, details and molding and blah, 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 all that stuff, I think you'd understand. I think I not only don't have a distinction, I think that often a really good interior design school like Parsons here, before the advent of where architectural education is today, was actually quite a lot better. I think it's a very interesting discipline when it is done from the condition of understanding history, for sure.
It's also a discipline that is, I think, consistently understood the sensual basis of buildings far more than architecture.
Well, it's also a discipline, Paul, let's face it, that contends in a believable way, not from a formal point of view, but in a believable way with a user operation. I mean, that people actually have to use it, okay? Right. And architecture has managed to distance itself somewhat, not to its credit always, from that condition.
Right. Exactly. I cannot resist, since it's getting late and toward our moment of adjournment, asking you this question. Could you discuss your use of cleavage in a post-Freudian world?
It's a tough crowd. When you mentioned a word, I mean, I knew that there was a linguistic thread.
I'll let you ponder that while I move on. But you'll wish I'd gone back to it. What do you mean when you say you have no intrinsic interests?
Intrinsic interests?
Did you in fact phrase it that way, or
did I say that?
I'm not sure you said it quite that way, actually, but.
Well, that's two.
Okay, let's keep going.
Are you keeping score or what?
What do you consider the phonemic elements of a semiotic architecture? We can keep going if you like.
Were you saving them all together, or what?
We are Okay, actually, let me give you this one. Do you teach to practice architecture, or do you practice to teach, or rather to learn for yourself? Would you read, learn, and study rather than do meaningless work, or would you give meaning to the mundane?
I think that an architect, I don't think you can teach architecture unless you practice architecture. I don't think you can practice architecture unless you teach architecture. I think by teaching, you give evidence of your own vulnerability. Students are properly iconoclastic. I think if you don't teach, and I do know architects that don't teach, their work bears the sign of an uncritical dimension, a lack of criticism, a lack of their own. I don't think you have to teach necessarily, but if you don't subject your work to peer review, to series where you bring in your friends and who then say, listen, that's problematic or a piece of junk because of blah, 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 blah. And you don't listen to it, and it is so solely based on your own individual view of the world, the work will have a naive, in the worst sense of the word, measure. I think that those that don't teach or subject themselves to the thoughts of younger people can be accused of that. I think that those that teach that don't build lose the paradigmatic potential and edge with students. I think one of the values of building as you teach is that your work gets subject to criticism from people like, and if it's not great criticism, that's cool too, because students will look at the teacher who built the project that was criticized by the guy, and that's not so bad. I think that remaining vulnerable, I guess is what I'm going round Robin Hood's barn to say, is really important as a human being. Because if you're not vulnerable, vulnerability has not been architects' long suit. And I think it's a problem. I think that if you are vulnerable, it means that you're subject to conditions imposed on you by clients, by things beyond your own expectations, your own persona, your own imagination, your own invention. And that's good. And I think that that's what one should subject oneself to if one wishes to get on with it.
I think you're right. I mean, I teach myself, and it's since in my position, criticism also needs criticism. And in fact, I find the most incisive and value-free criticism I get is from my students. They're the only ones who can come to you without really a vested interest in what criticisms they make. This is, I think, a good time, since we're at our hour of adjournment, for me to thank you, Stanley, for not only being here, but also for being so willing to make a schedule change at the last minute. Next week, Ricardo Bofill, whose work was the subject of a major exhibition last year at the Museum of Modern Art, will be here from Barcelona, Paris, and West New York, New Jersey, the three locations in which his major work now seems to be. And the following week, Philip Johnson, who was to have been here this evening, will be here on what had been Stanley Tigerman's night. Please thank you all for being here, and please join me in thanking Stanley Tigerman.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.